The letter arrived at the dusty ranch outside Genoa, Nevada Territory, in late September 1872. Though Willow Mae could barely make out the words her younger sister had written on her behalf before she'd left Missouri 3 weeks prior. She held the envelope in trembling hands as the stagecoach rattled away, leaving her standing alone on the packed earth road with a single worn carpetbag at her feet, staring at the rough-hewn gate that marked the entrance to what was supposed to be her new home. A tall figure approached from the direction of the ranch house, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. He wore a dark hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and as he drew closer, Willow could see the weathered lines around his eyes and the serious set of his jaw. This had to be Daniel Thornton, the rancher who had placed an advertisement seeking a wife, the man whose carefully worded letter she'd had read to her at least a dozen times before making the decision to leave everything she'd ever known. Miss Morgan. His voice was deep and cautious, and she detected something softer beneath the gruff exterior. "Yes, sir." She smoothed her travel-stained skirts and tried to stand taller, though at 20 years old and having never been anywhere beyond her small Missouri town, she felt impossibly young and foolish. Daniel removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with silver at the temples. He was perhaps 35, maybe closer to 40, with strong features and kind eyes that studied her with equal parts curiosity and uncertainty. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult. The stage route through these parts can be rough." "It was fine, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "Your ranch is beautiful from what I can see." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "It's home. Been in my family since my father staked the claim back in '59. Let me get your bag." He reached for her carpetbag, and Willow noticed the strength in his hands, the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. As they walked toward the ranch house, he pointed out various buildings scattered across the property: the barn, the bunkhouse where his 2 ranch hands stayed, the chicken coop, and the small stable. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. It looked well maintained, the wood still showing signs of relatively recent construction despite the harsh Nevada sun. "It's not fancy," Daniel said as he pushed open the front door, "but it's sturdy and it keeps the weather out." The interior was neat but sparse, with simple furniture and bare walls that spoke of a man who lived alone and saw no need for decoration. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and through an open doorway she could see a kitchen with a cast-iron stove and a wooden table. "Your room is upstairs," Daniel said, setting her bag down. "First door on the right." "I figured you'd want your own space until we get to know each other better and decide if this arrangement will work." Relief flooded through her. She'd been terrified he would expect immediate intimacy, as some of the horror stories she'd heard about mail-order bride situations involved. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Thornton." "Daniel," he corrected. "If we're going to be living under the same roof, we should use first names." "Daniel," she repeated, liking the way it felt on her tongue. "And I'm Willow." Over the next few days, they fell into a careful dance around each other, both trying to learn the rhythms of sharing a space with a virtual stranger. Willow threw herself into making the house more comfortable, cleaning corners that had long been neglected, and attempting to cook meals that wouldn't shame her mother's memory. Daniel spent long hours working the ranch with his hands, Jake and Pete, returning each evening dusty and tired but always with a kind word for her efforts. It was on the 4th evening, as they sat at the kitchen table finishing a dinner of beef stew and biscuits, that the thing Willow had been dreading came to pass. Daniel reached across the table and pulled a leather-bound book toward him. "I thought maybe we could start going over the ranch accounts," he said, opening the ledger. "If you're going to be my wife, you should know how the business operates. The expenses, the income from cattle sales, what we pay the hands." Willow's stomach dropped. She stared at the rows of neat handwriting, the columns of numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all the sense they made to her. Her throat tightened, and she felt heat rising in her cheeks. She struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal her shame. "Perhaps tomorrow. I'm rather tired from today." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. It's been a long week for you, adjusting to everything." But the next evening, when he brought out a newspaper he'd picked up in town, asking if she'd seen the article about the new silver strike up in Virginia City, she had to make another excuse. And the evening after that, when he started to hand her a letter that had arrived from his sister in California, she fumbled it and changed the subject so abruptly that she saw confusion flash across his face. It was the following Sunday evening that everything came to a head. They'd spent the day working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree branch, and despite her inexperience, Willow had proven herself capable and willing to learn. Daniel had smiled more that day than she'd seen since her arrival, and she'd felt something warm bloom in her chest at his approval. After supper, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Daniel lit the oil lamps around the main room and settled into his chair near the fireplace with a contented sigh. He picked up a small book from the side table. "Would you like me to read to you?" he asked. "It's just some poetry, but I find it pleasant in the evenings." Willow had been gathering up the dinner dishes, but she froze at his words. Something in her expression must have given her away because Daniel set the book down and studied her more carefully. "Willow, is something wrong?" The tears came before she could stop them, hot and humiliating as they spilled down her cheeks. She set the dishes down with shaking hands and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying desperately to compose herself. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room to her side. "What is it? Are you hurt? Sick?" "No," she managed, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I've been lying to you since I arrived." His hand hovered near her shoulder, uncertain whether to offer comfort. "What do you mean?" She forced herself to look at him, to face the judgment she was certain would come. "I cannot read. Not the ledgers, not the newspaper, not your letters or your poetry. I cannot read anything at all. My family was poor, and there was never money for school. My mother taught my younger sister, but by the time I was old enough to learn, she was too ill and then she died. I should have told you in the letter, but my sister wrote it for me, and I was too ashamed to admit the truth." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity. Willow waited for anger, for disappointment, for him to tell her she'd have to leave on the next stage. Instead, Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "That must have been very difficult, keeping that secret." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "And brave," he continued, "coming all this way to marry a stranger knowing this might be discovered. That took courage." Willow looked up at him in surprise. "You're not angry?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "Why would I be angry? You didn't choose to be denied an education." "That's not a moral failing, Willow. That's circumstances beyond your control." "But I lied. I let you think. You protected yourself," he interrupted gently. "And I understand why. But now that I know, we can do something about it. Do something." Daniel returned to his chair and picked up the book of poetry again, but instead of reading from it, he held it out to her. "I can teach you. If you want to learn, that is. It would take time and patience from both of us, but there's no reason you couldn't learn to read just as well as anyone." Hope fluttered in her chest, fragile and uncertain. "You would do that. Take the time to teach me. Willow, if we're going to build a life together, we need to be partners in all things. That means helping each other become better versions of ourselves." He gestured to the chair beside his. "Come sit down. Let's start tonight." And so began their nightly ritual by candlelight. After the day's work was done and supper cleared away, Daniel would light candles at the table and bring out a simple primer he'd purchased years ago, when thinking he might hire someone to help with the ranch paperwork. They started with the alphabet, Daniel patiently sounding out each letter while Willow repeated after him, her finger tracing the shapes on the page. She struggled at first, her mind resisting the strange symbols that refused to connect to the sounds they represented. Daniel never showed frustration, never made her feel foolish for not understanding. When she got confused, he would find new ways to explain, drawing letters in spilled flour on the table, or using a stick to scratch them in the dirt outside. "Think of it like learning to rope," he said one evening when she was particularly discouraged. "The first 100 times you miss. Your hand doesn't know how to move yet, your eye doesn't judge the distance right. But you keep practicing and one day it just clicks. Reading is the same way." As the weeks passed and autumn deepened into early winter, something else began to develop alongside Willow's growing literacy. The careful distance they'd maintained started to dissolve, replaced by a comfortable companionship that felt natural and right. Daniel would rest his hand on her shoulder when pointing out a word in the primer, and she would lean slightly into his touch. Their conversations during the day grew longer and more personal, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. One cold November evening, Willow was practicing writing her name for perhaps the 100th time, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The candles flickered in a draft from the window, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She finished the final letter and looked up to find Daniel watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You're beautiful when you're concentrating," he said simply. "I'm sorry if that's too forward, but it's true." Heat flooded her face, but she didn't look away. "It's not too forward. Not if I tell you that I've been thinking the same thing about you when you're working with the horses." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibility. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Willow, I know this wasn't a conventional start to things between us. I know we agreed to take our time, to see if we suited each other before making this marriage real in all ways. But I need you to know that somewhere along the line, this stopped being an arrangement for me. It became something real." Her heart hammered in her chest. "For me too. I think it started the first night you offered to teach me, when you didn't judge or condemn but just wanted to help. No one has ever been that kind to me before. You deserve kindness," Daniel said firmly. "You deserve respect and patience and someone who sees your worth." "I see yours too," she whispered. "You're a good man, Daniel Thornton, better than I hoped for when I answered your advertisement." He stood, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle and tentative, a question rather than a demand, and when Willow rose on her toes to kiss him back, she felt something slot into place in her heart that she hadn't even known was missing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing a bit unsteadily, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "We should do this properly. Would you marry me, Willow? Not as an arrangement, but as a real marriage, a real partnership." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." They were married by the circuit preacher the following Sunday, with Jake and Pete as witnesses and half the town of Genoa in attendance. Willow wore a simple blue dress that Daniel had bought for her from the general store, and there were wildflowers in her hair that she'd dried and saved from the summer. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Daniel kissed her in front of everyone, and she heard some of the ranch wives sighing romantically. The celebration afterward was boisterous, with food and music and dancing that went late into the evening. But eventually the guests departed, and Daniel and Willow found themselves alone in their ranch house, now truly theirs together. "Nervous?" Daniel asked as they climbed the stairs, his hand warm in hers. "A little," she admitted. "But excited too. Is that strange?" "Not strange at all." He opened the door to his bedroom, the room that would now be theirs. Someone, probably Pete's wife Sarah, had put fresh flowers on the dresser and new linens on the bed. A lamp burned low on the nightstand, casting a golden glow over everything. What followed was tender and sweet, Daniel taking his time to make sure Willow felt cherished and safe. He was patient with her inexperience, and when she cried out his name in pleasure, he held her close and whispered words of love against her skin. Afterward they lay tangled together, Willow's head on his chest as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I love you," she said into the darkness, the words feeling both momentous and natural all at once. "I love you too," Daniel replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "More than I thought possible when I first placed that advertisement. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Willow Thornton." She smiled at the sound of her new name, Willow Thornton. It sounded right, like coming home. The reading lessons continued through the winter, though now they took place with Willow curled against Daniel's side, his arm around her as they worked through increasingly difficult texts. She progressed faster than either of them had anticipated, her intelligence and determination making up for the years of missed education. By Christmas, she could read simple children's books on her own, and Daniel gave her a beautiful leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. "For writing down your thoughts," he explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth leather. "Or recipes, or anything you want, it's yours." She threw her arms around his neck, overcome with emotion. "Thank you for everything, for being patient, for teaching me, for loving me." "Always," he promised. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Willow had never imagined that marriage could be like this, that she could wake each morning excited to see her husband, that she could fall asleep each night feeling completely safe and loved. They worked together on the ranch, Willow learning to handle the horses and help with the cattle. Daniel taught her to rope and ride, to repair fences and manage the books. By spring, she was reading the newspaper to him while he worked on repairing tack, and he would listen with a smile on his face, interjecting comments about the various articles. She'd progressed to keeping the ranch accounts, her neat handwriting filling the ledgers with careful notation of expenses and income. "You're better at this than I ever was," Daniel admitted one evening, looking over her shoulder at the organized columns. "Everything is so clear and orderly." "That's because you're a good teacher," Willow said, turning in her chair to smile up at him. "You made it make sense." He bent to kiss her, and she pulled him closer, the ledgers forgotten for the moment as they lost themselves in each other. It was in late May that Willow realized she'd missed her monthly courses twice in a row. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain, but when June came and went with no sign of them, she could no longer deny what her body was telling her. She was with child. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She wanted this baby desperately, wanted to give Daniel the family he deserved, but she was also frightened of childbirth, of the very real danger it posed. Her own mother had died from complications when Willow was 12, and the memory still haunted her. Daniel found her sitting on the porch one evening in late June, staring out at the sunset with tears streaming down her face. He was beside her in an instant, his arm around her shoulders. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No," she managed. "I'm pregnant, Daniel. We're going to have a baby." The joy that lit up his face was unmistakable. "Truly, oh Willow, that's wonderful." But then he saw her tears and his expression shifted to concern. "Why are you crying? Do you not want this?" "I do want it," she said quickly. "So much. But I'm scared. My mother died in childbirth, and I keep thinking nothing is going to happen to you," Daniel said fiercely, pulling her tight against his chest. "I won't let it. We'll get the doctor from Carson City if we need to. We'll have Sarah stay here to help. We'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. You're not going to leave me, do you understand?" She nodded against his shirt, wanting to believe him, wanting his certainty to drive away her fear. True to his word, Daniel took every precaution. He hired Sarah to come stay at the ranch during Willow's final month, and he arranged for Dr. Mitchell from Carson City to be on standby for the birth. As Willow's belly swelled with their child, Daniel became even more attentive, refusing to let her do any heavy work and making sure she rested frequently. The reading lessons continued, though now Willow was teaching as much as learning. She'd found a collection of Shakespeare plays at the general store and had become fascinated with the language and the stories. On summer evenings, she would read aloud to Daniel while he worked on various projects, her voice carrying the words of Romeo and Juliet or Much Ado About Nothing into the Nevada dusk. "You have a gift for this," Daniel told her one evening as she finished a particularly moving passage. "The way you bring the words to life, it's like watching a performance." "Maybe I could teach our child someday," Willow said, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "Make sure they never have to struggle the way I did." "Our children," Daniel corrected, moving to kneel beside her chair and placing his hand over hers. "This is just the first. We're going to fill this house with love and laughter and children who know how much they're wanted." The baby came on a cold February night in 1874, arriving after a long and difficult labor that left Willow exhausted but triumphant. When Dr. Mitchell placed the squalling infant in her arms, she looked down at the tiny red face and fell instantly, completely in love. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, and Daniel, who had been hovering anxiously despite Sarah's attempts to shoo him from the room, moved to his wife's side with wonder written across his face. "A son," he breathed, reaching out to touch one tiny fist. "We have a son." They named him David, after Daniel's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he commanded their complete attention. Daniel proved to be a devoted father, taking to the role as naturally as he did everything else. He would walk the floor with David when the baby fussed, singing off key lullabies that somehow soothed the infant when nothing else would. Willow watched her husband with their son and felt her love for him deepen into something profound and unshakable. This was the man she'd traveled across half the country to marry, the man who had taught her to read by candlelight, who had seen her fear and shame and met it with kindness and patience. He was everything she'd hoped for and more than she'd ever dared to dream. The reading lessons evolved again, this time becoming bedtime stories for David. Even though he was far too young to understand the words, both Daniel and Willow would take turns reading to him, their voices soft in the nursery as the candles burned low. Willow loved these moments best, the three of them together, safe and warm and complete. As David grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Daniel's careful management and Willow's meticulous record keeping allowed them to expand their herd and hire 2 more ranch hands. The house that had seemed so large and empty when Willow first arrived now felt exactly right, filled with the sounds of a growing family. On David's second birthday, as they celebrated with a cake that Willow had baked and decorated, Daniel pulled his wife aside for a moment of quiet amid the chaos. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice low. "Leaving Missouri, coming here to marry a stranger?" Willow looked around the room at their son with frosting smeared across his face, at the home they'd built together, at the life they'd created. Then she turned back to Daniel and smiled. "Not for a single moment. This was the best decision I ever made. You taught me so much more than just reading, Daniel. You taught me what love really means." He kissed her then, sweet and tender, before they were interrupted by David demanding more cake. By 1876, David had a baby sister, Emma, and the ranch house rang with the sounds of children playing and learning. Willow had become an accomplished reader and writer, and she'd taken it upon herself to start a small school for the children of ranch families in the area. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, children would gather in the ranch's main room, and Willow would teach them their letters and numbers, giving them the gift of literacy that had been denied to her for so long. Daniel would sometimes sit in on these lessons, ostensibly to help manage the younger children, but really just to watch his wife teach with such passion and skill. He was immensely proud of her, of how far she'd come from the frightened young woman who'd arrived with a single carpet bag nearly 4 years ago. One evening, after the children had gone home and David and Emma were asleep, Daniel and Willow sat together on the porch as they often did, watching the sun set over the mountains. Willow had a book in her lap, a novel she'd ordered from San Francisco, and she read passages aloud to Daniel while he whittled a toy horse for David. "You remember that first night?" Willow asked, setting the book aside. "When I finally admitted I couldn't read and you offered to teach me?" "Of course I remember. That was the night I started to fall in love with you, though I didn't realize it at the time." "Really? Why then?" Daniel set down his whittling and took her hand. "Because you trusted me with your vulnerability. You let me see the part of yourself you'd been hiding, and that trust, that courage, it moved something in me. I'd been lonely for so long, Willow. I'd convinced myself that marriage was just about having someone to share the work, to help build the ranch. But that night, I started to understand it could be so much more." "It is so much more," Willow agreed, squeezing his hand. "You gave me not just literacy but confidence. You showed me that I was capable of learning, of growing, of being more than I thought possible. Every book I read, every letter I write, every child I teach, it all started with your patience and kindness that first night by candlelight. We gave each other something precious," Daniel said. "You gave me a reason to come home at the end of each day, a reason to build something lasting. You made this house a home, Willow. You made my life complete." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The ranch spread out before them, a testament to their combined efforts and shared dreams. From inside the house came the faint sound of Emma fussing and then settling back to sleep. "I want to write our story down," Willow said suddenly. "Not for anyone else, just for us and our children, so they'll know how we started, how we built this life together." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Daniel said. "And you'll write it beautifully with all those skills you've worked so hard to develop." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. In 1878, another son arrived, Jacob, named after Daniel's ranch hand who had helped them through so many difficult times. The little school that Willow had started grew, and eventually, the town of Genoa built a proper schoolhouse and asked Willow to be the teacher. She accepted, proud to serve her community and grateful for the opportunity to pass on the gift of learning to as many children as possible. Daniel continued to work the ranch. though he hired a foreman to help manage the day-to-day operations so he could spend more time with his family. He taught David to ride and rope, passing on the skills his own father had taught him. He would take Emma on gentle walks around the property, pointing out different plants and animals, nurturing her curious nature. On quiet evenings, the family would gather in the main room, and Willow would read from whatever book they were currently enjoying. The children would cuddle close, listening to their mother's voice bring stories to life, while Daniel would watch his family with contentment settling deep in his bones. Sometimes, after the children were in bed, Daniel and Willow would return to that original primer, the one they'd used during those first candlelit lessons. They would laugh at how difficult it had seemed at the time, how frustrated Willow had been when the letters wouldn't cooperate. "You were so patient with me," Willow would say, shaking her head at the memory. "You made it easy," Daniel would reply. "You wanted to learn so badly, you worked so hard. I was just there to guide you." By 1880, David was reading advanced texts and helping his mother at the school. Emma had started her own lessons and was proving to be as quick a learner as her mother. Jacob was a whirlwind of energy, keeping everyone on their toes with his adventures and mischief. The ranch had become one of the most successful in the region, known not just for quality cattle but for the Thornton family's fairness and integrity in all their dealings. Daniel and Willow had become pillars of the Genoa community, respected and loved by their neighbors. One spring evening in 1881, as Willow was preparing supper and Daniel was helping David with his arithmetic homework, there was a knock at the door. Daniel opened it to find a young woman standing on the porch, nervously clutching a small bag. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with tired eyes and worn clothes. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked kindly. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice shaking slightly. "My name is Margaret. I saw the advertisement you have posted at the general store about hiring help for the house and the school. I was hoping the position might still be available." Willow appeared at Daniel's shoulder, wiping her hands on her apron. She studied the young woman for a moment, seeing something familiar in her fearful hope. "Come in," Willow said warmly. "You look exhausted. Let me get you some coffee and something to eat and we can talk about the position." As Margaret entered the house, her eyes widened at the books lining the shelves, at the warm, lived-in comfort of the space. Over coffee and fresh bread, her story came out. She'd come west with her family, but they'd died of fever during the journey. She'd made it to Genoa alone, with no money and no prospects, desperately seeking any kind of honest work. "Can you read and write?" Willow asked gently. Margaret's face flushed red and she looked down at her hands. "No, madam, I never had the opportunity to learn." "If that disqualifies me, I understand." Willow and Daniel exchanged a long look, and in that glance an entire conversation happened. Then Willow reached across the table and patted Margaret's hand. "It doesn't disqualify you at all. In fact, if you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach you. My husband taught me to read when I first arrived here, and it changed my life. I'd be honored to pass that gift along to you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You do that, even though I'm just hired help. You're not just anything," Daniel said firmly. "Everyone deserves the chance to learn, to better themselves. If you're willing to work hard both at the house tasks and at learning to read, you'll have a place here for as long as you need it." Margaret stayed, moving into the small room off the kitchen that had been added during the last renovation. True to her word, Willow began teaching her to read in the evenings after the children were in bed, using the same primer that Daniel had used all those years ago. Daniel would often sit nearby, helping where he could, remembering those early nights with Willow and feeling grateful that they could now offer the same opportunity to someone else. Watching his wife teach Margaret, seeing the patience and understanding she showed, Daniel was reminded again of why he'd fallen in love with Willow in the first place. She had taken her own struggles and transformed them into compassion for others. She'd taken her shame and turned it into determination to ensure no one else had to feel that way. As the seasons turned, and 1881 became 1882, Margaret blossomed under Willow's tutelage. She proved to be a quick learner and a hard worker, and she became like an older sister to the children, who adored her. Eventually, she caught the eye of Pete's nephew, a young man who worked on a neighboring ranch, and by the spring of 1883 they were courting. Margaret's wedding that summer was a joyous affair, and when she left for her new husband's ranch, she took with her a collection of books that Willow had given her as a wedding present. As she hugged Willow goodbye, Margaret whispered, "Thank you for seeing me the way someone once saw you. You gave me more than literacy. You gave me hope." The years continued their steady march. David grew into a fine young man who helped run the ranch alongside his father. Emma developed a love of teaching and often assisted her mother at the school. Jacob discovered a talent for working with horses and spent hours training the ranch's stock. In 1885, another daughter arrived, Sarah, named after the ranch wife who had helped during David's birth and had since become one of Willow's closest friends. The house rang with laughter and sometimes arguments, with the sounds of learning and living, with love in all its messy, beautiful glory. Through it all, the evening reading time remained sacred. No matter how busy the day had been, no matter what challenges they'd faced, the Thornton family would gather after supper and read together. Sometimes it was the Bible, sometimes Shakespeare, sometimes penny dreadfuls that made everyone laugh. The content mattered less than the togetherness, the continuation of the tradition that had started with a frightened young woman and a patient rancher learning by candlelight. On a warm evening in June 1887, Daniel and Willow celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The children had planned a surprise party, decorating the house with wildflowers and convincing half the town to come celebrate with them. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, stories shared about the couple who had become such an integral part of Genoa's fabric. Later, when the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Daniel and Willow retreated to their bedroom. Daniel produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and handed it to his wife. "I know we said no gifts this year," he said with a sheepish grin. "But I saw this in Carson City last month and couldn't resist." Willow unwrapped the package to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, similar to the first one he'd given her years ago but more elaborate, with gold leaf decorating the edges of the pages. "For the story you wanted to write," Daniel explained. "About us, about how we started. I thought maybe now, with the children older and things a bit calmer, you might have time to work on it." Willow ran her fingers over the smooth leather, emotion swelling in her chest. "It's perfect." "Thank you, my love." She opened to the first page and found Daniel had already written something there in his neat hand. "For Willow, who taught me that love is patient, love is kind, and love is willing to teach by candlelight until the darkness becomes understanding. With all my love always, Daniel." Tears blurred her vision as she read the words. After all these years, he could still make her cry with his sweetness, his thoughtfulness, his unfailing love. "I love you," she said, setting the journal aside to take his face in her hands. "Every day I love you more than the day before. You are the best man I've ever known, Daniel Thornton." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me," he replied, pulling her close. That frightened girl who stepped off the stage all those years ago, She became the love of my life, the mother of my children, my partner in all things. I thank God every day that you answered my advertisement." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity mixed with the passion that had never faded between them. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the moonlight filtering through the curtains, Willow thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd arrived in Nevada territory unable to read a single word, terrified and alone, unsure of her future. Now she was a teacher, a mother, a successful rancher's wife, and most importantly, a woman who knew her own worth. All because one man had offered to teach her by candlelight and had shown her that learning was never too late. That change was always possible, that love could transform everything. Over the following months, Willow worked on the journal Daniel had given her. She wrote about that first meeting, about her terror at being discovered, about the kindness in Daniel's eyes when she'd finally confessed her secret. She wrote about the candlelit lessons, the slow progress, the frustration and the breakthroughs. She wrote about falling in love, about learning that partnership meant supporting each other's growth, about building a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. She wrote about their children, about the school, about Margaret and the other young women she'd helped over the years. On quiet afternoons while the children were occupied, she would sit on the porch with her journal and pen, carefully crafting the words that would preserve their story for future generations. Daniel would sometimes read over her shoulder, making suggestions or reminding her of details she'd forgotten. "Don't forget to write about how terrible your first attempts at biscuits were," he teased one afternoon. "Only if I can write about how you tried to help and somehow made them worse," she retorted, laughing. These moments of easy companionship, of shared humor and history, were among her favorites. They'd built something rare and precious together, and she wanted their children and grandchildren to understand that love wasn't always instantaneous or easy. Sometimes it grew slowly, nurtured by patience and watered by tears, until it became something strong enough to weather any storm. By the fall of 1887, the journal was nearly complete. Willow had filled page after page with her neat handwriting, a testament to how far she'd come from that night when she couldn't recognize a single letter. She was working on the final pages one evening when David, now 13 and thoughtful beyond his years, came to sit beside her on the porch. "Mother, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Were you really scared when you first came here? When you couldn't read and you thought Father would send you away?" Willow set down her pen and considered her son's question. She'd always been honest with her children about her past, wanting them to understand that everyone has struggles and that overcoming them is what builds character. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Not just of your father sending me away, though that was part of it. I was scared of being seen as stupid or worthless. I thought that not being able to read meant I had nothing to offer." "But you had lots to offer," David protested. "You're smart and kind and you work harder than anyone I know." "I know that now," Willow said, pulling her son close. "But it took your father's patience and love to help me see it. He taught me that intelligence isn't about what you already know. It's about being willing to learn, to grow, to keep trying even when things are difficult." David was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he said, "I want to be like Father when I grow up, patient and kind like that." "You already are, sweetheart. You're going to be an amazing man." As winter approached in 1888, the Thornton family settled into the comfortable rhythms they'd established over the years. The ranch was thriving, the children were healthy and happy, and Daniel and Willow's love continued to deepen with each passing season. One snowy evening in December, as the family gathered around the fireplace with mugs of hot cider, Willow finished reading the final page of A Christmas Carol to the children. They'd made it a tradition to read the story each year during the holiday season, and everyone had their favorite parts. After the children had gone to bed, Daniel and Willow remained by the fire, enjoying the quiet and the warmth. Daniel pulled out the journal she'd been writing, now complete and bound in its leather cover. "I read it," he said softly. "The whole story, start to finish. And what did you think?" "I think you've created something beautiful, Willow. Not just the words themselves, though those are lovely, but the story you've told. It's honest and real and full of love. Our children will treasure this and their children after them." "I hope so. I wanted them to understand that our family was built on more than just circumstance. It was built on choice. You chose to be patient with me. I chose to trust you. We chose each other every day, even when things were hard." Daniel set the journal aside and pulled his wife into his arms. "I choose you still, every day. I always will." The years continued to flow like water, each one bringing new experiences and deeper connections. The children grew and began families of their own. David married a schoolteacher from Carson City in 1892, and they settled on a portion of the ranch that Daniel deeded to them as a wedding present. Emma followed her mother's footsteps into teaching, eventually taking over the Genoa school when Willow decided to reduce her hours. Jacob, wild as he'd been as a child, settled into being one of the finest horse trainers in Nevada territory. And young Sarah showed signs of inheriting her mother's love of books and learning. By 1895, the ranch house that had once seemed so empty rang with the voices of grandchildren. And Daniel and Willow found themselves in the strange position of being the family elders, dispensing wisdom and watching their legacy unfold. Through it all, the evening reading tradition persisted, though now it often included grandchildren piled onto laps and sprawling across the floor. Willow, her hair now showing silver threads like Daniel's, would read with the same passion and skill she'd developed over decades of practice, and Daniel would watch her with undimmed love in his eyes. On a warm spring evening in 1897, 25 years after Willow had first stepped off the stage in Genoa, the extended Thornton family gathered for a celebration. It was Daniel and Willow's silver anniversary, and no one was willing to let the occasion pass without proper recognition. The party was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the trees and enough food to feed half the county. People came from miles around to celebrate the couple who had become legendary in the area for their love story, their generosity, and their commitment to education and community. As the sun began to set and the dancing started, Daniel pulled Willow away from the crowd for a private moment. They walked to the spot where he'd first greeted her all those years ago, where she'd stood with her single carpet bag, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. "Do you remember standing right here?" Daniel asked, his arm around her waist. "How could I forget? I thought my life was ending, or at least changing in ways I couldn't predict or control. And now—" Willow looked back at the party, at their children and grandchildren, at the friends and neighbors who had become family, at the life they'd built together through patience and love and countless evenings of teaching by candlelight. "Now I know it was beginning," she said softly. "Everything good in my life started the day I met you, Daniel. You taught me to read, but more than that, you taught me that I was worthy of love and respect. You showed me that growth is always possible, that it's never too late to learn something new, to become someone better." "We taught each other," Daniel corrected gently. "You taught me that strength comes in many forms, that vulnerability can be a gift, that building a life with someone means supporting their dreams as much as your own. You made me a better man, Willow." She turned in his arms to face him fully, this man who had been her teacher, her partner, her love for a quarter of a century. His face showed the lines of age and years of working under the Nevada sun, but his eyes held the same kindness that had first drawn her to him. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time she'd spoken them. "I love you more than all the words in all the books we've read together." "And I love you," he replied, kissing her softly, "more than I could ever express, even with all those words at my disposal." They stood there as the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, holding each other and listening to the sounds of celebration drifting on the evening air. Behind them was a lifetime of memories, of lessons learned and love given freely. Ahead lay more years together, more grandchildren to teach, more evenings by candlelight reading and talking and simply being together. As they walked back to join their family, Willow thought about that frightened young woman who hadn't been able to read her own marriage contract. She'd been so ashamed, so certain that her lack of education meant she had nothing to offer. But Daniel had seen past that, had recognized her worth and her potential, and had been willing to invest the time and patience needed to help her discover it for herself. The reading lessons by candlelight had been about more than just learning letters and words. They'd been about trust and partnership, about two people choosing to build something together despite their differences, about love growing in the quiet moments of everyday life. Now, surrounded by the fruits of that love, Willow understood that her inability to read hadn't been an ending but a beginning. It had brought her to Daniel, had given them a reason to spend those precious evening hours together, had taught them both about patience and perseverance and the transformative power of education. The party continued late into the night, with speeches and toasts and stories shared about the Thornton family and their impact on the community. When David stood to speak about his parents, his voice thick with emotion, he talked about the example they'd set for all their children. "My parents taught us that love isn't just a feeling," he said, raising his glass. "It's a choice you make every day. It's patience when things are difficult. It's kindness in the face of fear. It's teaching by candlelight until understanding dawns." They showed us what a true partnership looks like, and we're all better for having witnessed it. As everyone raised their glasses to toast, Willow found herself crying happy tears. She reached for Daniel's hand and he squeezed it gently, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Later, after the guests had departed, and the children and grandchildren had settled into various rooms throughout the house, Daniel and Willow climbed the stairs to their bedroom. They moved more slowly now than they had 25 years ago, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and long years, but their love remained as strong as ever. As they prepared for bed, Willow noticed Daniel had placed something on her nightstand. It was the original primer they'd used for those first reading lessons, the pages now yellowed and worn from years of use and being passed down to children and grandchildren. "I thought you might like to look at it," Daniel said, climbing into bed beside her. "Remember where we started?" Willow picked up the primer, running her fingers over the familiar pages. She could still remember the frustration of those early days, the letters that refused to make sense, the words that seemed impossible to decode. But she could also remember Daniel's patient voice, his encouraging smile, his unwavering belief that she could learn. "You changed my life with this little book," she said, setting it carefully back on the nightstand. "You gave me a gift I can never repay." "You repaid it 1,000 times over," Daniel said, pulling her close. "Every time you taught a child to read, every time you helped someone like Margaret learn their letters, every time you showed our children the importance of education, you repaid it. You took what I gave you and multiplied it, spreading literacy and hope throughout our community. I couldn't be more proud of you, Willow." They fell asleep that night as they had so many nights before, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The years after their silver anniversary passed peacefully. Daniel gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, turning more of the responsibilities over to David and Jacob, while he spent time with his grandchildren and helped Willow with her various educational initiatives. They'd started a small lending library in Genoa, stocked with books they'd collected over the years, and Willow spent several afternoons a week there, helping people find books and offering reading lessons to anyone who wanted them. The library became a gathering place for the community, a testament to the Thornton family's commitment to literacy and learning. Above the door, Daniel had hung a sign that read, "It's never too late to learn," a motto that had guided their lives and now guided the library's mission. In the summer of 1900, as the new century dawned, the family gathered once more for a special occasion. Emma, now married with children of her own, had been offered a position as principal of a new school being built in Carson City. It was a tremendous honor and a recognition of her skill as an educator, but it also meant moving away from Genoa. At the celebration dinner, Emma asked her mother to say a few words. Willow stood, looking around at the faces of her family, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she'd been given. "When I arrived in Nevada territory almost 30 years ago, I couldn't read a single word," she began. "I was ashamed and frightened and certain that my lack of education meant I had nothing to offer the world. But my husband saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He saw potential. He saw worth. And he was willing to invest his time and patience in helping me discover those things too." She paused, her eyes finding Daniel's across the table. "What I learned during those candlelit reading lessons wasn't just how to decode letters and words. I learned that education is a gift we give ourselves and others. I learned that growth is always possible, regardless of age or circumstance. I learned that true love supports and encourages rather than judges and condemns." Turning to Emma, she continued, "My darling daughter, as you take this new position, remember that every student who enters your school carries their own fears and struggles. Some will hide them better than others, but they are all there. Your job isn't just to teach them reading and arithmetic. It's to show them their own worth, to help them see their potential, to give them the tools they need to build better lives." Emma was crying now, as were several others around the table. "I'll try to be half the teacher you've been, Mother." "You'll be even better," Willow assured her. "You've had advantages I never did, and you've used them well. I'm so proud of you, Emma. Your father and I both are." As the celebration continued, Daniel pulled Willow aside once more. They developed a habit over the years of stealing quiet moments together, even in the midst of family chaos. "You were magnificent," he said, kissing her forehead. "You always know just what to say." "I learned from the best," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "You taught me that words have power, and I've tried to use them wisely." They stood together, watching their family laugh and talk and celebrate, and Daniel felt a profound sense of contentment settle over him. This was what he'd dreamed of all those years ago when he'd placed the advertisement seeking a wife. Not just someone to share the work, but a true partner to build a life with. And he'd found so much more than he'd ever hoped for in Willow. As the seasons continued their endless cycle, Daniel and Willow entered the autumn of their lives with grace and gratitude. They spent their days working in the garden Willow had cultivated over the years, visiting with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and reading together on the porch as they'd done for decades. The reading time remained sacred, though now it was often interrupted by little ones demanding stories or asking questions. Neither Daniel nor Willow minded these interruptions. Each grandchild represented a continuation of the legacy they'd built, another generation that would value education and literacy. On a cool evening in October 1905, as they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets and watching the sunset, Willow asked Daniel a question that had been on her mind. "Do you think we've done enough? Left a good legacy?" Daniel considered the question seriously, as he always did when Willow asked something important. "I think we've done more than enough. Look at what we've built, not just this ranch but this family, this community." David runs the ranch with skill and integrity. Emma has helped educate hundreds of children. Jacob's horse training program is known throughout the state. Sarah is writing books that teach children to read using the same principles we used all those years ago. He paused, taking Willow's hand. "But more than that, we've shown people what love looks like when it's built on mutual respect and support. We've demonstrated that it's never too late to learn, never too late to grow, never too late to become something more. That's a legacy worth leaving, Willow." She nodded, satisfied with his answer. "I just want to make sure that when we're gone, people remember what we stood for." "They will," Daniel assured her. "How could they forget? There are too many people whose lives we've touched, too many children we've taught, too many stories being told about the rancher who taught his mail-order bride to read by candlelight." The story of their courtship and early marriage had indeed become something of a local legend, retold and embellished with each passing year. But at its core remained the truth. Two strangers who had become partners, a patient teacher and an eager student, a love built on thousands of quiet evenings spent learning together. As winter approached in 1906, Daniel began to slow down noticeably. He was 70 now, and the years of hard ranch work had taken their toll on his body. He moved more carefully, tired more easily, though his mind remained sharp, and his love for Willow never wavered. Willow, at 54, still moved with energy and purpose, but she adjusted her pace to match Daniel's. They'd always been in step with each other, and that didn't change now. If he needed to rest more frequently, she rested with him. If he couldn't walk as far as he once had, she found ways to bring the world to him. On Christmas Eve of that year, with the house full of family and the smell of pine bough and cinnamon filling the air, Daniel asked everyone to gather in the main room. He had something he wanted to say. "I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon," he began, bringing chuckles from the assembled group. "But at my age, you start thinking about what you want to leave behind, what you want people to know." He reached for Willow's hand, pulling her to stand beside him. "What I want you all to know is that the greatest decision I ever made was placing that advertisement seeking a wife. And the greatest blessing I ever received was when this remarkable woman answered it. She came to me unable to read, ashamed of what she saw as a failing, and I had the privilege of teaching her. But what I didn't understand then was that she was teaching me too." His voice grew thick with emotion. "She taught me about courage and determination. She taught me that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. She taught me that love grows deepest when it's cultivated in the quiet moments, in the everyday acts of patience and kindness. She taught me what it means to be truly seen and accepted for who you are." Turning to look at Willow directly, he continued, "You are the love of my life, Willow Thornton. You are my best friend, my partner, my reason for getting up every morning. Teaching you to read by candlelight all those years ago was just the beginning. We've spent every day since then learning from each other, growing together, building something that will outlast us both." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as he pulled her into his arms and kissed her tenderly. The grandchildren, even the youngest, seemed to understand they were witnessing something special, a love that had endured for over 3 decades, and would endure as long as anyone remembered the Thornton family. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Daniel and Willow lay in their bed looking at the stars through the window. They designed the house with a large window positioned so they could see the night sky from their bed, a small luxury that had brought them countless hours of peaceful contemplation. "Thank you," Willow whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For everything. For seeing me when I felt invisible. For teaching me when I felt unteachable. For loving me when I didn't love myself. For building this life with me, this family, this legacy. For every candlelit reading lesson, every patient explanation, every moment of kindness and support. Thank you for all of it, Daniel." He pulled her closer, his voice rough with emotion when he spoke. "And thank you for trusting me enough to admit you couldn't read. Thank you for being brave enough to learn, to grow, to let me see all of you, the strong parts and the scared parts. Thank you for giving me children and grandchildren, for making this house a home, for turning my lonely existence into a life full of love and purpose. Thank you for every day we've had together, Willow. Every single one has been a gift." They fell asleep that way, holding each other under the stars, two souls who had found each other across distance and circumstance and had built something beautiful together. The years that followed were gentle ones. Daniel's health continued to decline slowly, but he remained mentally sharp and emotionally present until the end. He passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1909, with Willow holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Daniel Thornton. Ranchers he'd done business with, children he'd helped educate, neighbors he'd supported through hard times, all came to pay their respects to a man who had lived his values every day of his life. Willow, though heartbroken, stood strong through the service. When it came time for people to share memories, story after story emerged about Daniel's kindness, his integrity, his patience and wisdom. But the story everyone kept coming back to was how he'd taught his mail-order bride to read by candlelight, how he'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, how he'd built a love story that had become legendary in their community. In the days and weeks after Daniel's death, Willow found comfort in the life they'd built together. She was surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried Daniel's values forward. The ranch continued to prosper under David's management. Emma's schools were educating hundreds of children using principles Willow had developed. Jacob's horse training program employed several young people from the area. Sarah's books were being used in schools across Nevada. Willow herself continued teaching at the library, finding purpose in helping others discover the joy of reading just as Daniel had helped her. She particularly sought out those who were embarrassed by their lack of literacy, remembering how that shame had felt and wanting to ease it for others. On quiet evenings, she would sit in the chair by the fireplace where Daniel used to sit, and she would read aloud even though he was no longer there to listen. It made her feel close to him, continuing the tradition they'd established all those years ago. Sometimes her grandchildren would find her there and ask her to tell them about their grandfather, about how they'd met and fallen in love. Willow would smile and begin the story the same way each time. "It all started with a letter I couldn't read and a patient man who offered to teach me by candlelight." And she would tell them about those early lessons, about falling in love slowly through shared learning, about building a partnership based on mutual respect and support. She wanted them to understand that love wasn't always dramatic or instantaneous. Sometimes the deepest love grew in quiet moments, nurtured by patience and watered by tears, until it became strong enough to weather any storm. Willow lived for another 12 years after Daniel's death, remaining active and engaged with her community until the very end. She taught reading to her last student just weeks before she passed away peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1921, at the age of 69. At her funeral, which was even larger than Daniel's had been, person after person stood to talk about how Willow had taught them to read, had helped them discover their own worth, had shown them that it was never too late to learn something new. The local newspaper ran a long article about her life and contributions, calling her the heart of Genoa's educational community. But what everyone remembered most was her love story with Daniel, how they'd found each other and built something remarkable together. The story of the mail-order bride who couldn't read and the rancher who taught her by candlelight had become a symbol of hope and possibility, a reminder that love and education could transform lives. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations of Thorntons who continued to value education and literacy. The library that Daniel and Willow had started grew into a proper public library, with a reading room named in their honor. Above the fireplace in that room hung a portrait of Daniel and Willow from their silver anniversary, looking at each other with such love and devotion that viewers often found themselves moved to tears. The leather journal Willow had written, telling their story from beginning to end, became a treasured family heirloom, passed down and read by each new generation. In it, they found not just a historical record but a guide for how to love well, how to support each other's growth, how to build a partnership that could weather any storm. Years later, when great-great-grandchildren asked about Daniel and Willow, they were told about the candlelit reading lessons, about patience and perseverance, about two people who chose each other every day and built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. They were told about courage in the face of shame, about kindness in the face of ignorance, about love that transformed everything it touched. The story of Daniel and Willow Thornton lived on, inspiring generation after generation to value education, to support each other's growth, to believe that it's never too late to learn something new, and most importantly, to understand that the deepest love is built not in grand gestures, but in thousands of small moments of patience and kindness. In the end, what had started with a frightened young woman stepping off a stage in Genoa, Nevada territory, in 1872, had become a legacy that touched countless lives. The inability to read that Willow had been so ashamed of became the foundation for a love story that would be remembered for generations, a reminder that our perceived weaknesses can become our greatest strengths when we have someone who believes in us, supports us, and is willing to teach us by candlelight until the darkness becomes understanding.